spent years collecting interests like other people collect receipts. Photography, coding, ceramics, psychology, maybe gardening for 3 months. Then you stopped. Not because you didn't care, because something else caught your attention. And now you're sitting with a dozen half-finished projects, a browser full of saved tutorials, and a quiet, gnawing feeling that maybe you're just scattered. Maybe you lack discipline, focus, the thing everyone else seems to have that lets them pick one path and stay on it. You see people online who found their thing at 22 and never looked back. They have portfolios, credentials, a clear answer when someone asks what they do. And you have a hard drive full of beginnings. It doesn't feel like curiosity anymore. It feels like failure. But here's what nobody tells you. That feeling, that guilt, it's not because something's wrong with you, it's because you're living in a world that wasn't designed for the way your mind actually works. There's a psychological trait researchers have been studying for decades. It's not a disorder, it's not a flaw, it's a cognitive style. And it shows up in people who don't fit neatly into one category, one career, one identity. The research calls it high openness to experience combined with broad learning orientation. But that's not how it feels when you're living it. What it actually means is your brain is wired to seek variety, to explore, to connect ideas across domains instead of drilling down into one. You're not distracted, you're integrating. But in a culture obsessed with specialization, that looks like a problem. Because we've been taught that mastery requires narrowing, that expertise means saying no to everything except one thing. And if you can't do that, if your attention keeps drifting towards something new, then clearly you're not serious. But Generation X, the people born between the mid-1960s and early 1980s, they lived through something most people don't talk about. They entered adulthood during economic collapse. The dot-com bust wiped out entire industries. The 2008 financial crisis destroyed careers people had spent decades building. Loyalty didn't protect anyone. Expertise in one field wasn't enough. And the ones who survived, they were the ones who adapted, who learned new skills, who could pivot, who didn't put all their identity into one narrow lane. The research from the Longitudinal Study of American Life tracked thousands of people through these disruptions, and what they found was that educational attainment mattered, yes, but adaptability mattered more. The ability to learn something new when the old system collapsed, the willingness to start over without seeing it as failure. Those aren't the people who spent 20 years perfecting one skill. Those are the people who stayed curious, who kept learning, who never fully committed to one identity because they understood, consciously or not, that nothing lasts. That's not scatteredness, that's survival intelligence. But here's where it gets hard, because the world doesn't reward that, at least not visibly. When you apply for a job, they don't ask if you can learn 5 different things and connect them in surprising ways. They ask if you have 10 years of experience doing one specific thing. When you meet someone at a party, they don't want to hear about your 3 concurrent interests. They want a clean answer, one sentence, one identity. And so you start to internalize it. You start to believe that your inability to pick one thing means you're not committed enough, not focused enough, not serious. You look at people with clear, singular paths and you think they have something you don't. Discipline, vision, certainty. But what if they just have less cognitive flexibility? What if their minds don't make the same kinds of connections yours does? What if staying in one lane isn't strength, it's just a different wiring? The data from Solston's Global Psychological Assessment, the one that analyzed over 3 billion people, found something interesting. Generation X scored higher in self-control than Millennials and Gen Z. Higher, not lower. These are people who grew up as latchkey kids, who managed their own time from age 8, who learned early that consequences were real and immediate. Self-control wasn't the issue. The issue was that their interests didn't fit into the boxes society had prepared. And that's the painful part, because the guilt you feel isn't about what you're doing wrong, it's about what the culture can't see. It can't see that exploring multiple domains builds a different kind of expertise. The kind that doesn't show up on a resume, but shows up when systems break, when industries shift, when the future requires people who can think across boundaries instead of inside them. You're not failing at focus, you're succeeding at adaptability, but adaptability is invisible until it's needed. Here's what the research on Gen X leadership revealed. The ones running companies now, the ones holding 31% of leadership roles despite being only 20% of the population, they're not specialists, they're bridges. They understand traditional business models and modern digital workflows. They lived through analog and digital. They speak multiple languages, not literally, but cognitively. They can translate between generations, between systems, between old and new. That didn't come from picking one thing and never letting go. That came from living through change and staying curious enough to learn what came next. The Great Place to Work research analyzed hundreds of thousands of employee comments, and what they found was that Gen X employees wanted leaders who were role models, not distant visionaries, not motivational speakers, people who could solve problems, who were approachable, who could engage at every level. That's not the profile of someone who spent 40 years in one silo. That's someone who learned enough about enough things to connect with people across domains, to see patterns, to adapt. And that's what your brain is doing when it jumps from interest to interest. It's not abandoning things, it's building a network, a way of thinking that doesn't rely on one path staying open. You know what nobody tells you? Mastery isn't always depth. Sometimes it's range. There's this quiet assumption that the only way to be good at something is to do it for 10,000 hours, to eliminate everything else, to narrow and narrow and narrow until you're the best at one very specific thing. But the world doesn't actually work that way anymore. The problems that matter, they don't fit into one discipline. Climate change isn't a science problem or a policy problem or an economy's problem. It's all of them. Artificial intelligence isn't just coding, it's ethics and psychology and design and law. The people who can navigate that complexity aren't the ones who spent their whole life in one field. They're the ones who can hold multiple frameworks in their mind at once, who can borrow insights from one domain and apply them to another. That's what your scattered interests are training you to do. But you have to stop measuring yourself by the old metrics. Stop asking if you're as deep as a specialist. Start asking if you're seeing connections they're missing. Because here's the shift. The guilt you feel isn't because you're doing something wrong, it's because you're judging yourself by someone else's definition of progress. Progress for a specialist looks like vertical movement, deeper into one thing, more credentials, more hours, more refinement. Progress for you looks like horizontal movement, more contexts, more connections, more fluency across different ways of thinking. Neither is better, they're just different. But we've been told for so long that depth is the only legitimate form of expertise, that breadth feels like cheating, like you're not doing the real work. But you are. You're doing different work. And if you can stop trying to force yourself into a shape that doesn't fit, if you can start recognizing what your mind is actually good at, the guilt starts to lose its grip. You don't need to pick one thing. You need to stop believing that picking one thing is the only way to matter. So what does that actually look like? Not as a theory, as a life. First, you stop calling it distraction. You start calling it exploration. And that's not just semantic, because when you label something as distraction, you're reinforcing the idea that it's a problem, that it's something to fix. But when you call it exploration, you're giving yourself permission to learn without the pressure of committing forever. You're allowed to be interested in something for 6 months and then move on. That's not failure, that's completion. You learned what you needed. You got what that domain had to offer, and now you're integrating it. Second, you start tracking connections instead of progress. Most productivity advice tells you to track how much time you spent, how many hours, how many projects finished. But that doesn't work for a mind like yours, because your value isn't in the individual outputs, it's in the way you connect them. So instead, you ask, what did learning about design teach me about writing? What did cooking teach me about problem solving? What did that random obsession with urban planning show me about systems thinking? When you start seeing the through lines, the guilt fades, because you realize you weren't scattered, you were building a framework.
Third, you stop comparing timelines. The specialist career arc is predictable. They start at entry level, they move up, they gain seniority, they become the expert. It's linear. Yours isn't. You might spend 5 years in 3 different fields before something clicks. You might look like you're behind, and then suddenly you're not, because you see an opportunity no one else saw, a connection no one else made, a solution that required knowing 2 things that aren't supposed to go together. That moment doesn't show up on schedule. It shows up when the pieces align. And you can't rush it by forcing yourself to be someone you're not. And fourth, you build a life that rewards variety instead of punishing it. That might mean freelancing instead of a traditional job. It might mean a role that lets you move between projects. It might mean reframing your hobbies not as distractions from your real work, but as essential inputs to how you think. Because if you keep structuring your life around the expectation that you should be doing one thing, you'll always feel like you're failing. But if you structure it around the reality that you do multiple things, that you think in networks, that you need variety to function, then suddenly the guilt stops making sense. You're not broken. The system just wasn't built for you. And that's okay. Because the future doesn't need more people who do one thing perfectly. It needs people who can think across boundaries, who can adapt, who can see what's coming because they're not locked into one way of seeing. You've been training for that your whole life. You just didn't know it had a name. So maybe the question isn't, why can't I just pick one thing? Maybe the question is, what am I building that nobody else can see yet?